Hi, and welcome back to this last part of the series on the reliability of the Old Testament from a historical perspective. In the last lecture, we moved from prehistory to the earliest parts of the historical records, and we found that the narratives of Genesis and Exodus have far more to commend them than we might expect, even if, for various reasons, including their age, we don't have specific corroboration of individual people and events. As I said, this is no surprise at all. This is just how ancient history works. But once we get into the history of Israel as a nation, and as they begin to interact with other civilizations, this is exactly when we would expect significant external corroboration. And this is exactly when we begin to find it. So let's look first at the United Monarchy, when Israel was still a whole unified nation. Now again, we should start with our historical limitations. We should realize that no Assyrian rulers had direct contact with the land of Israel before 853, so it is unlikely that we would find Assyrian sources before that time mentioning Israel. Likewise, Egyptian sources after Ramesses III and Shoshenq I, who I mentioned in the first lecture, don't mention any powers in the land of Canaan. Since Shoshenq I was after Saul, David, and Solomon, this is pretty significant. It means there's not any reason that we should expect good evidence outside the Bible of these figures, though I will argue that we do have some. So finally, perhaps the most significant limitation is that Jerusalem is not easy to excavate. Indeed, excavating certain parts of Jerusalem would potentially start a world war. Some parts of the edge of the old city have begun to be excavated, and I've even done part of that myself, and they have found impressive items, including the first mention outside the Bible of the prophet Isaiah. We might even have David's palace excavated to this day. But let's go back and take things in order. We can start with David since he is the most prominent early king, and in some ways the most controversial. As I mentioned in an earlier lecture, before 1993, it was common for scholars to say that he never even existed. As the historian Philip Davis put it not too long before that, the figure of King David is about as historical as King Arthur, who, in case you didn't know, was not historical. Now, I don't know how Davis responded, and perhaps it's kinder not to ask, when in 1993 at Tel Dan in the far north of Israel, an inscription turned up saying, "And the king of Israel entered formerly in my father's land, and Hadad made me king. I killed blank Ram, son of blank, king of Israel, and I killed blank Yahu, son of blank, king of the house of David." Now this is a stunning piece, since it likely mentions Jehoram, the king of Israel, and likely also Ahaziah, the king of the house of David, which is a specific reference to Judah being separate from the rest of Israel, as the Bible described. Of course, it mentions David by name and his house, implying that he was the founder of a dynasty rather than just an insignificant tribal leader. But perhaps most striking of all, it describes the murder of two Israelite kings, Jehoram and Ahaziah, one king of Israel and one king of Judah. Now this corresponds exactly to 2 Kings chapter 9, which describes Jehu murdering both Jehoram and Ahaziah one after the other. In fact, we even have a picture of Jehu himself on another Assyrian obelisk, describing him giving tribute to the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III. But knowing that there was such a phrase as the house of David, Beit Daud in Hebrew, scholars then realized that they had a reference to David all along in the Mesha stela from the 9th century BC. In this stela, Mesha, king of Moab, says, "I am Mesha, son of Chemosh, king of Mesha the Dibonite. My father ruled over Moab for 30 years. Israel utterly perished forever, and Omri had taken possession of the land of Medeba, men of Gad, and the house of David dwelt in Horonon." And there are bits missing, which is why it doesn't quite sound right. But this stela mentions not only Mesha, the Moabite leader known from the Bible, it also mentions Israel, Omri, the king of Israel, the tribe of Gad, which we know was based next to Moab, and the place Medeba, which was also mentioned a few times in the Old Testament. Once again, it mentions the house of David, and this was a century or two after he lived. So David was clearly the founder of the dynasty of Judah, and just 30 years ago, he was thought by many historians never to have even existed. So what did skeptical scholars say in response? Well, they began to say that yes, David existed, but he never had a proper empire. He was just the leader of a small settlement, maybe around Jerusalem. But again, recent evidence clearly shows otherwise. The first evidence is circumstantial. We know that this was pretty much the only time in the history of the region when an Israelite empire could really flourish, with a vacuum of power from other nations in the region. But we have more concrete evidence as well. Recent excavations have been done at Khirbet Qeiyafa, which is many miles from Jerusalem. In fact, it is on the border with the Philistines. And these excavations have shown that there was a heavily fortified Israelite city from exactly this right period in the early 10th century. This site had no pig bones, which confirmed that it was Israelite. It had its main entrance facing towards Jerusalem, suggesting deference to Jerusalem. There was even found a literary work in Hebrew, suggesting considerable literacy and culture in Hebrew, far from Jerusalem. It also had standardized storage jars, which were likely for tax collection and manufactured nearby. They even had handles specifically indicating that they were for use by the king. The evidence, therefore, which was recently excavated, clearly shows that the Judahite empire which David founded was a centralized empire with heavily fortified sites many miles from Jerusalem and on the border with enemies. In fact, perhaps most amazingly, a few years ago, a leading non-Christian archaeologist, Eilat Mazar, declared that she had likely found David's very own palace in Jerusalem. And to this day, you can go and see that now. Likewise, the Millo, which was mentioned in 2 Samuel 5 verse 9 at the very start of David's reign, has likely also been excavated, and you can see that with your very own eyes next to his palace. So just to give you a sense of where scholarship has moved, therefore, let me quote from leading archaeologist William Dever, who is certainly not a conservative scholar and doubts many things about David's life in the Bible. He nevertheless says that we know with relative certainty that David existed as a king in the 10th century BC, that he founded a well-known dynasty, that he embellished his capital in Jerusalem, that he saw an expanding population and increasing urbanism, that he had fortified borders, that he was successful in wars against the Philistines, and that his national dynasty and self-identity lasted centuries until the 6th century BC, the time of the Babylonian exile. He goes on to say that it is possible or probable that David had a particularly legendary character, that he made efforts to establish a forced labor system to build the temple, and that he dominated other neighbors as well as the Philistines. But just to show that Dever is not a biased conservative scholar, he says it is unlikely that David annexed large parts of Transjordan and that he made significant gains into Syria against the Arameans. But still, what Dever says is likely about King David is a pretty impressive list for someone who apparently never existed just 30 years ago. Now, I won't say anywhere near as much about King Solomon, but it is worth mentioning that scholars have highlighted the realism of his foreign relationships, the sizes of his temple and palace, and even his legendary wealth. The genre of poetry and instructional wisdom that he typified was common in this period. But perhaps most interestingly, it is known that Shishak, who we mentioned earlier, who invaded the land shortly after Solomon's death, spent a particularly large amount back in Egypt during his dynasty, which is perhaps a reflection of Solomon's considerable wealth that Shishak would have plundered when he invaded Israel. Now, once we get to the divided monarchy from 930 BC onwards, when the northern kingdom and Judah were divided, the history is pretty clear and unassailable. Again, we still have some limitations. The Assyrians didn't reach the area until the mid-9th century, and Aram does not have many local records from this time, and Egypt generally didn't mention foreign rulers unless they had a friendly relationship. Nevertheless, despite this, we have an impressive array of evidence for the Israelite and foreign leaders of this time. So the graph that you can see shows a chronological timeline with externally corroborated Old Testament characters. Now, this timeline perfectly illustrates the general principles of history. Firstly, that as time goes on, more and more evidence accumulates, and particularly there are large amounts during major wars where they interacted with other civilizations. You can see particular clusters of externally verified people around the Assyrian destruction of the northern kingdom in the 8th century, and the Babylonian destruction of Judah and exile in the 6th century. The Biblical Archaeology Review highlights a huge number of Old Testament characters found outside the Bible. So we now have verified these figures from the Old Testament. The Egyptian leaders Shishak, So, Tirhakah, Necho II, and Hophra. The Moabite leader Mesha. The Aramean leaders Hadadezer, Ben-Hadad his son, Hazael, Ben-Hadad his son, and Rezin. From Assyria, we have Tiglath-Pileser III, Shalmaneser V, Sargon II, Sennacherib, and Adramelech his son, and Esar-Haddon. From Babylon, we have Merodach-Baladan II, Nebuchadnezzar II, and his official Nebar-Sarsekim, Evil Merodach, and Belshazzar from the story of Daniel. From Persia, we have Cyrus II, Darius I, Xerxes I, Artaxerxes I, and Darius II. For Judah, we have the kings David, Uzziah, Ahaz, Hezekiah, Manasseh, and Jehoiakim. We have the high priests Hilkiah and Azariah, the scribe Shaphan, the officials Gemariah, Jehukal, and Gedaliah, along with Shelemiah and Pashur. So there are absolutely loads. And there are a variety of others that I didn't even mention, including even Balaam from Numbers, though sadly his talking us has not been verified externally. Now, I say all of this not to bore you, but just to show you how strong the evidence for the more recent parts of the Old Testament is. It is firm, concrete history that has been verified outside of the Bible. What's more, the biblical chronology of all of these leaders aligns perfectly with the chronology that we know from other sources. But we even have some evidence of some specific events, many of them in fact. The invasions of Assyria and the Babylonians, of course, are very well known, but I'll mention just a few things that might be less well known. The first of them I mentioned in the first lecture from the very beginning of the divided monarchy 3,000 years ago. This is the invasion of Shishak from Egypt, which we know from his own records, as well as 1 Kings chapter 14. But a particularly remarkable event is shown from 2 Kings chapter 19, 200 years later. The mighty Assyrians have come to Jerusalem and they wait outside the gates, having destroyed countless cities and towns outside of Jerusalem. And King Hezekiah is distraught and he doesn't know what to do. And so the prophet Isaiah says to King Hezekiah, "Do not give in. The Lord has spoken, and the Lord has said that Sennacherib of Assyria will not enter this city or shoot an arrow here. Instead, he will leave." Now, remarkably, we have a prism from Sennacherib, the Assyrian leader, which perfectly fits with this, though of course it doesn't mention the God of Israel, and there is a lot more arrogance in it. It says, "As for Hezekiah, the Judean who did not submit to my yoke, I surrounded and conquered 46 of his strong-walled towns and innumerable small settlements around them by means of earth ramps and siege engines and attack by infantrymen. He himself," meaning Hezekiah, "I shut up in Jerusalem, his royal city, like a bird in a cage." And so he never mentions taking Jerusalem or even attacking Jerusalem. And given the context, this was absolutely remarkable because Hezekiah did not give him what he wanted, and the Assyrians were far more powerful than Jerusalem and could easily have destroyed it. So Sennacherib here confirms the biblical account, which, given this awesome power, perhaps even required a miraculous event to turn the Assyrian leader away. And that is the miraculous event that the Bible describes the detail behind. So this brings us finally in our series to the exile. And as I said, again, we have impressive evidence for this, both in terms of the broad outline and even in the details. Now, of course, there are plenty of physical remains from the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem to this very day. If you go to Jerusalem, you can even find, not yourself, but from excavators, Babylonian arrowheads from this invasion and various other signs of the destruction. This is, of course, partly why the temple is not there to this day. The later version of the temple, of course, was destroyed by the Romans as well. Now, the external sources from Babylon confirm that the Babylonians initially stayed at home despite Jehoiakim rebelling against them. But the Babylonian sources confirm that in 597, the Babylonians attacked Judah, they captured the king, and they appointed a new king, exactly as the Bible describes. But we know that they took Jehoiakim into exile. So one of the most amazing findings that has been found in Babylon were a series of ration tablets allowing rations for people kept in captivity there. And one of these ration tablets in Babylon specifically mentions by name Jehoiakim, king of Judah, and his sons, which of course confirms the very last line of 2 Kings, which describes the Babylonian king giving Jehoiakim a regular allowance while he was in exile in Babylon. So one final thing from after this, just to show how carefully the Bible reflects reality without even trying to boast about historical knowledge. Daniel enters the story in exile in Babylon. And there's a particular curiosity about the book of Daniel in chapter 5, verse 16, when King Belshazzar tells Daniel that if he can read the writing on the wall and interpret it, Belshazzar would make Daniel the 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom. But this is a bit strange, because why would he not make Daniel the 2nd highest ruler in the kingdom? Who is the 2nd highest ruler in the kingdom, and why does Daniel have to be the 3rd? Well, it's never explained in the Bible, but it actually carefully reflects historical reality from this time. Because we know from external sources that at this precise time in history, Belshazzar was in fact serving as the king because there was another king of Babylon, Nabonidus, who had gone into exile himself in Arabia. So precisely for this reason, Nabonidus was still recognized as the king of Babylon, but Belshazzar was acting as king in place of him back home in Babylon. Now, the Bible doesn't explain this in any contrived way. It just very subtly reflects historical reality by referring to the 3rd ruler of Babylon, implying that there were 2 kings without actually saying it. And so, of course, the rest of the Old Testament, as they say, is history. The Persians fairly quickly took over, and when Cyrus of Persia restored the Jewish people, this fits perfectly with what we know from external sources about Cyrus's policy of religious tolerance. And so we know throughout the Old Testament that Abraham journeyed from Ur near Babylon, and by the end of the Old Testament, Abraham's entire people had been exiled in Babylon. But all this time, from Babylon and to Babylon again, the narrative stays firmly grounded in real history, in real times and real places. And so, as with almost all historical writing, there is some metaphor and symbolism throughout. And as we move further back into prehistoric times, the blend of history and symbolism in the Old Testament becomes considerably more complex. But even then, at the very start, the history does not entirely disappear, as much as has sometimes been supposed. So if you want to find out more, there are fortunately some wonderful books on this subject. The most spectacularly comprehensive is Kenneth Kitchen's On the Reliability of the Old Testament, a masterpiece which takes you from Eden to Babylon and then back to Jerusalem. John Walton's books on Genesis are very helpful, but of course they are only one perspective on what has for an extremely long time been a particularly controversial and difficult part of the Bible to analyze theologically and historically, so I offer his work merely as one perspective. J.A. Thompson's book, The Bible and Archaeology, is an older book, but it is still an excellent introduction to the archaeology of both the Old and the New Testaments. And finally, for the most up-to-date research and concise, accessible articles on almost any archaeological topic in the Bible, the Biblical Archaeology Review offers a great mix of conservative and liberal scholarship to really give you a good understanding of what the current scholarly consensus is. As you might guess, I lean to one conservative side of that consensus as an Orthodox evangelical Christian, but it helps to give you a good understanding of where scholars are at as a group. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that these 3 lectures have helped to strengthen your own convictions, and I also hope that they will help you reach out to others who might have their own doubts as well, whether Christian or non-Christian. It's really important that we understand this huge portion of the Bible and that we see that it is grounded in historical reality, that it is not just a made-up part that we can forget and pretend doesn't exist. It is really something that is rooted in history and that we can really depend on to strengthen our understanding of God and our understanding of the Bible. So I really hope and I pray that it helps you to understand this body of literature better and that it helps you to grow in your relationship with God as well. So thank you so much for listening.
Hey guys, how are we doing? My name's Nadia and I'm part of OCCA, the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. And we just want to say thank you for watching our video. At OCCA, we love to look into the big questions facing our time and our culture to see how the Christian faith gives answers that are both rational and rich in their understanding. If you enjoyed this video and you want to come along with us, then why not check out the rest of the content on this channel? Please consider subscribing and following as well, so that we can keep on making content like this. We really want to hear from you guys, so if you have ideas of questions that we can look into or content that we can make, then please drop a comment down below or get in touch with us directly. We want to say thank you as well to the speakers, to the donors, to the filmmakers, and also to you guys for making it happen. You know, it takes about 60 hours to create a film like this, and that's because we want it to be carefully researched. We want the talk to flow beautifully, and we want the filmmaking to be smooth. But that all takes time. And here at OCCA, our staff are funded by people who share our vision. So if you want to partner with the work that we are doing, please consider donating. I'll catch you next time.